Hello, Dr. Melanie Stein, and welcome to the Tick Boot Camp podcast.
Thanks, Rich. I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, and we should share with folks that this is not the first time we've met, right? We actually had an opportunity to meet at the ILADS conference a couple of months ago in Texas. And I wanted to have you back for a long form podcast because that was actually a really cool interview, but we had a very narrow window of time, and I interviewed you and your partner together, and we talked more about your practice in general than we were able to talk about you and your journey. So because you were so awesome during that interview, I wanted to make sure that we had you come back for a long form. And then again, just coincidentally, we already had you scheduled to come back before with you. So, it was one of those kinds of things, right? So I thank you for taking more time out for us, and I thank you for being willing to share your journey on our long form podcast. So again, thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
So, why don't we first begin with where are you physically? Where are you today?
Yeah, I'm in Portland, Oregon. Nice rainy Portland, Oregon today, although we've had a nice winter with some sun, but
Well, welcome Portland, Oregon to Tick Boot Camp. And can you introduce your? I think by the time this plays, we probably will not have released your other episodes. So let's not assume that folks know who you are and the name of your business and what work you do. So why don't you give us that background as well?
yeah, sure. So my name is Dr. Melanie Stein. I own Restorative Health Clinic in Portland, Oregon. And, I view Restorative Health Clinic as a really special clinic. I actually bought the clinic originally from my mentor, Dr. Werner Voslow,
That's
who
cool.
developed the clinic as a place for help and healing. And I really pride Restorative Health Clinic as being on the cutting edge of Lyme disease and co-infections, as well as other environmental toxicities. And, we're a unique clinic in the sense of our clinic is a family. And so we have 3 doctors, a nurse, and a whole IV room of team, that treats these patients here.
So, am I correct in recalling that you and at least one of the doctors you practice with met at an ILAS conference and started practicing together?
No, actually, we met in medical school. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, so Dr. Smelas and I met in medical school and became very good friends in medical school. And through the process of actually watching me go through Lyme and then recognizing it in her practice, we joined forces after I bought the clinic from Dr. Voslow.
All right. So, I interviewed so many people during that conference
Mhm.
that unfortunately my old brain is a little jumbled. So thank you for correcting me. It was actually medical school where you guys had met. Um,
Mhm.
so let's now walk it back to your background. I'd like our folks to learn more about you and where you came from and where you grew up.
Sure. So I was born in San Diego, California. Although I'll be honest, I don't really remember it. I moved to Portland, Oregon when I was 4 or 5 years old with my family. And growing up, I had a pretty great childhood. We owned a motorhome, and every weekend we would go camping. And back then, Lyme disease was a foreign word out here in the Pacific Northwest. I would go tromping through the wilderness and through the bushes, and never did we think about tick checking or, even that ticks existed.
So you went from the warm contours of San Diego, California, to the Pacific Northwest, but you had the outdoorsy life, and it seems you had a really enjoyable time, despite not knowing that you were being stalked by ticks and other types of diseases. So. Talk to us about your educational experience. Where did you go to school, and what kinds of things did you enjoy? And did any of that signal to you that at some point you were going to practice medicine?
Yeah. Um, my early childhood education was a little bit rough, if I'm going to be honest. I had a lot of anxiety as a child, and middle school was very difficult for me. I could not keep up athletically with the other students or with the stamina of the other students, and the anxiety often led me spending time in my counselor's office rather than engaging in classwork. Even though I think, when I look back on it, my intelligence level was long beyond my years. And I think that was some of it. I got that classic ADD diagnosis and was put on medication. And then when I entered high school, that's when I really struggled. I remember the first couple of weeks of being in the classic high school with, 1,000 kids in your graduating class and getting really overstimulated by all the loud noises and the people all around me. And I actually ended up dropping out of high school. I found an alternative high school that was really incredible. And that's when I learned about the Running Start program. And so I don't know if they have that out on the East Coast, but out here, that's a program where the state actually pays for you to take college credits, and that counts as your high school credits. And so I graduated with my halfway through my associate's degree, halfway through college. And that's when I found a calling. I felt challenged by the schoolwork, and I really resonated with the community that was a little bit older than me. And I did at that point in my life have a little bit of a rough childhood, or, early adolescence, where my brother and I really needed to stick together. And so, I ended up working 3 different jobs at one point while going to school. And one of those jobs was a veterinary clinic. And I absolutely fell in love with veterinary medicine. And there was a part of me at that age that thought, oh, maybe I'll go to veterinary school and medical school and someday open up a clinic that says, we treat the whole family. And I was actually all set to go to veterinary school. And kind of a long story, but I was actually the office manager of a chiropractic clinic at this time too. And, the chiropractor that I was working for said to me, "Hey, Mel, why are you not going to become a naturopath?" And I said, "What's a naturopath?" And I always had a love for plants and medicine. I was a big outdoor enthusiast my whole life. And, I wanted to be an herbalist as well, but, success was a big part of the pressure that was put on for me and my family. And, this chiropractor signed me up for an exploration day at NUNM here in Portland. And by the end of the day, I was changing my entire career path. And 3 weeks later, I started school at NUNM, and I graduated with my doctorate in naturopathic medicine and a master's in acupuncture.
Well, congratulations. That's a really cool academic story. And you've now outlined a whole bunch of stuff that I'd like to dig in.
All right.
On. So let's first talk about some of the mental health issues that you were outlining for us that began seemingly very early in life. You were anxious, and you were so anxious that you sought, or your family encouraged you to seek medical intervention. So what was that anxiety like? And how did you ultimately make a decision, or your family make a decision, that you were going to begin to treat that anxiety?
I'm not sure that I really had a choice when I was younger to treat the anxiety. When I really think back on it, I have memories in, even elementary school where I had frequent urination. And I think that was a manifestation of my anxiety. And even in middle school when, we would be told to run a mile, and my heart would be racing and I'd be dizzy, and then I'd get anxious of why I couldn't keep up with the kids. My mom is an incredible woman, and I owe a lot of my life and my accomplishments to the support that I've had from her. And she really fought for me. And so she sought out different specialists and different answers, and in that day and age, this is what you did for children who had these types of symptoms, right? You medicated them. And so, I know that I remember just vaguely, going to many different doctors at a very young age and trying different medications to stabilize me throughout that period of my life.
So one of the questions, of course, Dr. Stein, that comes to mind, especially after having interviewed not only on this podcast so many psychiatrists and psychologists, but so many of the psychiatrists and psychologists that I interviewed at the ILAS conference, is that anxiety is a very typical symptom of somebody who's suffering from Lyme disease. And I understand that the medical community generally, certainly when you were young, although you are still very young. I mean, as an old man, I wish I was as young as you. I think the medical training that most psychiatrists have is designed to medicate you sooner rather than later. And I'm just wondering whether or not, when you were at the early phase of the mental health issues that you were dealing with and the anxiety, Whether anyone ever suggested that perhaps you be tested for Lyme disease.
No, definitely not. And, as we progress into my story more, you'll hear as actually I had the opposite experience where people told me it was all in my head and I did not have Lyme disease. But, really looking back on it, I remember as early as middle school having these abdominal attacks as well, where I would get very severe abdominal pain. I would start to vomit. I'd end up in the hospital, and even I went to this Jewish overnight camp, and I remember that I would spend nights on end in the infirmary rather than out with my peers because of these abdominal attacks. And when I look back on this, I can't help but wonder if these were the early signs that, perhaps I had either congenital Lyme or did acquire Lyme with, how adventurous I was in my youth.
Yeah, and we've had many young people, or many people who, when they were young children, went to camps, went to summer camps, and as a result of being in these summer camps where there was not adequate education and training for the counselors and or the campers, that children were being bitten by ticks, and they ultimately acquired their disease as a result of the poorly trained camp counselors and the medical community that that supports campers. In fact, we had one of our guests bitten by ticks several times during the time that she was at camp, and she actually revealed to her mother when we interviewed her on this podcast that she was bitten by ticks, that she went to the infirmary at the camp, and they never told her mother. Her mother never knew until she came on this podcast and shared that with her mom. So, I can't help to think that not only you're outdoorsy, and of course very healthy with your family bringing you, to have outdoor experiences, but you buttress that with spending time as a camper, and it's likely you were bitten by ticks.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, poses the other point of the tick that's most likely to spread Lyme is the nymph tick, right? And so many of us actually never remember being even bitten by a tick. And as a child, if we grow up in an area where we're not taught to look for them, there's even more of a chance we would never recognize it on us.
Of course, right? And
So,
most people, as you know, as a doctor who specializes in this area, most people who have Lyme disease do not recall having been bitten by a tick. I think the stats are as high as 80%. So, and I think it's because A, we're not trained to check for ticks, and B, they're so small and they're so stealthy, that it's hard to find them, right? I mean, it really is hard to find them. It's certainly hard to find them if you're looking with your eyes, right? One of the things that folks on this podcast know is that Matt calls me the tick magnet, because I have ticks on me all the time. But I argue I'm not a tick magnet. I think we all have ticks on us all the time. I'm just a tick checker, and because
Well,
I grew up.
Rich, you're such a tick magnet that you sent a photo of a Lone Star tick to our local friend group here, just I think it was like 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, oh, were you bit again? And you're like, nope, it's just a memory on my phone. I'm like, who saves memories of tick bites in their phone? I mean, come on, you get bit that much, right? But anyway, this is a side note.
So, so yeah. So, let's talk about how your what were you what was going on with you physically? You just share with us that you were having some gastro issues. Were they directly linked to the anxiety and what you were dealing with emotionally, or was that sort of a separate set of symptoms that were being treated by other medical professionals?
sure. I mean, that's certainly what was told to me, right? Was that, oh, nothing's wrong with your gastrointestinal tract. This is just a manifestation of your anxiety. But, looking back on it, I don't believe that. Looking back on it, I believe that, whether or not it was Bartonella or another infection that I had at that time, there was something actually going on with me. There were times where I was perfectly happy. I mean, who wouldn't be happy out at summer camp in the woods with all of your best friends? The last thing I wanted to do was be spending time in the infirmary. And, yeah, so I guess the answer is no, I don't believe it. I think back on this time and I don't have very distinct, solid memories of this time. I kind of just have little flashbacks of memories, but I do remember being in severe abdominal pain and very nauseous. And, later on when I did first get my diagnosis, that was one of my first symptoms to come back. And, at that point in time, that's when I feel like the medical community actually took me seriously with these abdominal and gastrointestinal symptoms. And I was actually diagnosed with Crohn's disease at that point.
So let's stay with the path. You're a young child. You're dealing with
Mhm.
anxiety. You're dealing with gastrointestinal issues. The belief is that your mental health issues are triggering your gut issues, rather than acknowledging that perhaps you have brain inflammation, and the two-way communication between the vagus nerve and the gut could have been actually physiologically impacting your gut, and which could have been a signal that you were dealing with brain inflammation from Lyme disease, or an infection from Lyme disease, or immune dysfunction from Lyme disease. The three eyes that we all talk about, but nobody was acknowledging that or recognizing that. So they medicate you. How did the medication impact you? Did it have a positive impact? Did it have a negative impact? Did it have no impact?
I hated it. I felt numb on it. And I think that that was what I had the hardest time with is, I would take a handful of pills in the morning and then that would cause me to be nauseous. Right. And then I would spend an hour or two in the morning being nauseous until I finally got over it. But one of the things that when I really look back on this is it didn't allow me to feel my emotions. And I think that that's such an important part of childhood, that we need to feel our emotions and learn to communicate our emotions, to help us as we grow. And so I did not like being medicated. And, throughout that period, it was, for a couple months, you're going to try this medication, and a couple months, you're going to try this medication. It was this side effect, caused hallucinations, or this side effect increased your anxiety. This side effect caused mania. And I feel like it was more of a battle of one side effect after the next side effect versus something that actually helped me and allowed me to engage in my life better.
You anticipated the question that I was going to ask you next, which was, what impact was this having on your onboard diagnostic system or your emotions, right? Because our emotions are signals to us, and when we don't feel well, it's important for us to know that, so that we can now figure that out ourselves, and give information to our healthcare professionals, so that they're in a better position to help us to help ourselves, right? And when you were medicated, of course, that has now tamped down the signals from your onboard diagnostic system, and it made it more challenging for you to feel what you needed to feel in order to be able to help your doctors to diagnose you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that compounded with the attitude that I grew up with was, when you don't feel good, take a shower and you'll feel better. Right. So the two of those together, I think, really caused me to suppress a lot of my emotions, and also not know what they were.
Yeah, and there is a balance that we have to strike. Certainly, as parents, I've parented four daughters. We have to strike the balance between, of course, listening and encouraging our children to listen to their bodies and get in tune with their bodies and understand what their emotions are. But at the same time, you don't want them to be too whiny either, right? I mean, you sort of have to strike this balance. And I understand the thought of a parent saying to you, "Go take a shower, you'll feel better," right? Just it'll help you to calm down. The warm water will help you to calm down. But at the same time, you're right. We certainly shouldn't be gaslighting children so that they are now tuning out their signals that they were given, so that they can identify what's wrong and help doctors to help them. So, um, talk to us about how things progressed as you got into, your later, I guess, junior high and high school experience. And you said you were frustrated that you weren't able to keep up athletically.
Mhm.
And so how were your physical symptoms developing, and how were your emotional symptoms developing?
Yeah, middle school was very, very challenging for me because of the differences that I had in, athletic performance and academic performance. I was made fun of a lot as a kid. And so, I kind of just I had some friends, but for the most part, I kept to myself, kind of just put my head down and got through middle school. And then, in high school, I think for me, it was really that aha moment, right? It was that aha moment finding my community, and that when my symptoms really shifted. So I wouldn't necessarily say that my symptoms got much worse than what we've already outlined. It was really, I think, finding this community and finding this place where I belonged, that my anxiety did get better. Um, that, or I think I found purpose and meaning in my life. You'll kind of hear a theme within my story that I think I work through a lot and I push a lot out. And that's something I really realized in preparing for this podcast of, wow, I pushed away a lot of these symptoms just to get through life. And so, yeah, I guess I wouldn't say that I got really any worse at that point. I think my story actually takes a high note after that, where, I start feeling better and I go to college, and, I was doing really great until I got sick again.
So but essentially you were gritting through your symptoms. Your symptoms didn't improve, your life improved because you were able to grit through them. So we have the tough
Mhm.
Dr. Stein getting through all of the, well, you were a doctor then, right? But we have this
Yeah,
kid who's gritting through all these symptoms and gritting through the challenges, but finding her place, right? You found your place academically, but you also found places in different types of medical arenas, right? First in
right.
veterinary office and then in a chiropractic office. So talk to us about, your passion for science. How did that develop? Was that something that developed, because you were working vocationally
Mhm.
in places where science was the foundation, or was this something that you always had an aptitude for and then ultimately developed a passion for when your
Yeah,
mentor or one of your mentors encouraged you to go to medical school?
sure. Can I back up for a second, Rich,
Yeah,
before you
yeah.
do? Because I think there's a key part here, just kind of reflecting back on some of the themes we've been talking about, is I just want to make a point here that when I turned 18, I was able to get off all the medication. And I stopped all of the medication. And I think that at that point, I sought counseling and therapy. And that is when I really learned tools of how to deal with this anxiety. I don't feel like up until that point in time, it was medicate, don't learn tools. And so, I'll circle back and answer that question, but I want to kind of,
Oh, but let's stay with that point. I
yeah.
think it's an important, I think that's an important issue to focus on, right?
Hmm.
Because one of the biggest failures of the educational system is that we're not taught how to use our brain, right? Not just our body, but our brain. And our brain, I would argue, is the most important organ that we have, and it controls everything from the day we were born until the day that we die, and everything in between. And I think the worst thing that happens is when we start to have challenges with our brain, they're made worse in many cases with the medications. So what was the trigger for you coming off the medications? Was it just because you reached the age of majority and you're allowed to make that decision, or was there something else?
No, that was exactly it. As I reached the age of majority and I could make the decision myself, and I didn't want to feel numb anymore. Walking to the bus stop to go to school every day, I would throw up. I didn't want those feelings anymore, and I wanted to know what I felt like so that I could get the help that I needed. And I didn't even know where to start because I didn't know how I felt.
So where did you turn to when you decided you were going to come off of the pharmaceuticals and now work with someone who's going to teach you how to use your brain?
Hmm. I had at this alternative high school I went to. I'm an early riser, so I was still in high school when I turned 18. And there was an incredible counselor at the school, Heather Sherman. And to this day, I'm seeing her this weekend. She's a really powerful figure in my life. And I would spend an hour a day in her office, and she would help me learn tools and techniques, and, talk to me about what was actually happening in my body, recognizing the physical symptoms in my body, and how to, use self-talk. And as a matter of fact, that's the first time I even heard the word the limbic system, right? We talk about the limbic system all the time in chronic illness. And so, learning these tools, even just as simple as 4 square breathing, or, where you run your fingers along your hand, or simply recognizing what was happening in my body. I think for me, I'm a type A personality, right? So if I can deduce what is happening in my body and make reason to it, I can calm myself down.
So the tools that you were given or you developed with working with this seemingly very enlightened school therapist was how to calm down your brain, right? Your brain was in overdrive. As a result of being in overdrive, you were constantly in fight or flight. You were constantly feeling anxious. And what this therapist was able to teach you were some of the tools that allowed you to calm down your brain, right?
Hmm.
What else did she teach you? I mean, did she just teach you these tools on how to calm down your brain, or did she teach you the difference between being in rest and digest versus fight or flight? Did she talk to you about the difference between your conscious mind and your subconscious mind? Did she talk to you about, cognitive psychology and the psychocybernetic living? How much did she give you at that early stage of your educational development.
Yeah. I don't think we went that far in depth. Later on in life through therapy now and in the coming years, I did start to learn about that. But, I think just kind of on a very superficial level helped me understand what I was feeling, which, as an 18-year-old woman, fresh into the world of independence, that was huge, right? Because I had spent so much of my life not understanding what emotions were and what I felt. And so that was a big feat to learn how to feel again.
Oh, for sure. Look, and it's really painful. I mean, anxiety is really painful. And because it's hard to see that pain, someone teaching you just some fundamental tools, did you say box breathing and some of these other tools that can calm down your amygdala and take you out of that, out of that suffering is unbelievably powerful. And clearly this was laying the foundation for you to go to medical school, right? I mean, we're starting to see that develop where you're a sick kid physically and emotionally. You are medicated and seemingly over medicated. I'll let you decide whether you were or weren't, or describe whether you were or weren't. But you then decided that when you became a young adult, that you were going to seek other tools. And the first set of tools that you were given by this enlightened therapist was a set of tools that helped you to get out of the suffering state that you seemingly were in for maybe a decade.
Right. And I think there was something about, it was someone who believed in me, right? It was someone who listened to me and believed in me. And, this is kind of circling into your next question is, I was in my senior year with 0.5 credits towards my college or my high school degree, right? And everyone was telling me, you're not going to graduate on time and, forget it. And, this therapist, Heather, she sat down with me when I came up with my plan of how I was going to go to the community college and graduate in 1 year. And she said, all right, let's do it. Whereas everyone else was like, Mel, you're crazy. That's not going to happen. And so having an adult figure that not only was teaching me how to feel my emotions, listen to my emotions, but then also believed in me was extremely powerful.
Let's talk about belief, right? And that's a triggering subject. Anytime you're talking about anyone with a chronic illness, certainly with Lyme disease. And I think one of the things that people often find frustrating is they're told, if you don't believe you'll get better, you will not get better. But then nobody talks about what it means to believe and what belief is and how important it is to recognize that sometimes people are going to be uploading beliefs into your head that are not serving you, right? And I think that's one of the things that maybe we should focus on, right? It seems to be that although you had a very supportive family and you've already saluted your mom, which is wonderful. Despite coming from a supportive family and having a supportive mom, you really didn't have beliefs that were allowing you to be served well. So talk about the challenges that you had with beliefs that were not serving you, and how working with this enlightened therapist, not only did she help you to calm down your brain and to help you get out of the suffering state, but she was then also helping you to develop belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very easy for us to have linear thinking in life, and actually I was just having a conversation about this with someone the other day, how sometimes when we look at life, we see things in one way and one way only. And I really believe that through the power of belief, we can open up our minds to see that there are many different possibilities and many different avenues. And, for me with school, the way that this really manifested is, again, right, 0.5 credits. I don't remember how many credits I needed to graduate, but it was a lot, right? 4 years of schooling. And, how is anyone ever going to do that? And, I think that through the power of belief, through the power of believing in myself, right? Knowing that if you put your mind to something, anything can be possible. And, I just think that throughout my life, I've shown that over and over again. I'm a very spiritual person. And so, through meditation and, visualizing my success, visualizing my recovery, right? I was really able to work through some of these other disbeliefs that people put on us, right? And I think it's very easy for people to judge us and for people to see us in certain lights and in certain ways. Look at believing in Lyme disease. How can we believe in Lyme disease when it's right in front of our eyes? I'm not sure I'm quite answering the question.
Yeah, no, you're answering the question brilliantly. And no, I really, I think you're answering the question brilliantly because, you know, part of what you're now teaching our listeners is that there was a progression and a development of, you know, your use of your brain. Your brain was working against you. You were in a suffering state. It was you know, so aggressively working against you that you were heavily medicated. And you know, there are upsides and downsides to medication, and I don't want, you know, we're agnostic here at Tick Boot Camp. Any tool
Sure.
that helps is a good tool, right?
Mhm.
But then you took that pause, you stopped the medication, and you went on this journey where you learned about your brain, right? You got out of the suffering state with an enlightened person who was teaching an 18-year-old kid, I only say that because I'm an old man, how to get out of a suffering state, and gave you the tools you needed to do that. Once your brain was calm, then she was able to help you to believe, in part because she was supporting you with a belief to do something that seemed impossible, but as it turns out, nothing is impossible. It's only what we believe is impossible that's impossible. And you get through 4 years of school in a year because you believed you could do that. And then you start to mature into using other tools where now your brain becomes something that is not hurting you, but it's helping you. And you're using tools like meditation and visualization and other types of tools that allow you now to calm your brain to the point where it is now tapping into infinite knowledge. And when you're tapping into that spirit, now nothing is impossible, right? You can do anything, like go to medical school.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. And you know, something else I think that is important is that it's not even just the power of belief, because I think sometimes with chronic illness we can get stuck in this, you know, everyone else thinks I should be better, but I have this invisible illness and people don't understand us, right? But I think that belief can play a role in, you know, maybe I'm not going to be better today, but I believe in the medicine that I'm taking, right? When I, you know, the energy that we put into this medication that we're taking or these treatments that we're doing, believing that they can work, right?
Yeah. So one of Matt and I actually did a video which we haven't published yet about identity. And one of the podcasts that I follow argues that there are actually three types of identity. I'd really like to get your reaction to this. All right. So he argues that there is the lie-identity, which is the beliefs that we have in our head that have been uploaded as a result of all the people we come in contact with telling us we cannot do something. You're not tall enough, you're not short enough, you're not athletic enough, you're not whatever enough, right? All of the enoughs get stuck in our head. That's the identity. Then we have the my identity. And the my identity is our reaction to that. You know, we create this false identity that is now showing everyone that I am tall enough, or I am short enough, or I am thin enough, or I am young enough, or I am old enough, whatever I was doing. That's again another lie. And then he talks about the identity, which is really our true essence and who we are. And you know, as you're sharing your story, I'm hearing a lot of the lie identities, which then created a my identity. And then you had this, you know, this wonderful experience of finding a mentor when you were 18 years old who helped you to find your identity.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, sorry, I'm just letting what you just said sit in, because I think that's one of the most beautiful explanations that I can hear about how we come into our being, right? And it's very easy for us to use perceptions of the world as to who we should be or who we want to be. And I think, you know, we have this need to please people, right? This need to please people and to conform into other people's views of us, and how throughout time we can really become true to ourselves. And, you know, I think one of the lessons that I'm learning right now specifically is that being myself doesn't always have to mean I need to please everyone, and it's okay to disappoint others.
Well, look, and Dr. Stein, another thing we should keep in mind is that people pleasing is really an element of being in fight or flight, right? When you have Lyme disease, your body knows that you're under attack, even though that you don't know that you're under attack, even though you don't have a diagnosis yet, even though you, in your case, were medicated and you weren't allowed to feel that you're under attack, your body knows you're under attack. And because your body knows you're under attack, we have a response to an attack, which is fight or flight. or the sympathetic expression of our nervous system, right? So when we're in the sympathetic expression of our nervous system, there are only five expressions. It's fight, flight, freeze, faint, fawn, right? And fawning is this feeling that we have to please everyone, right? So that's how this disease, this insidious disease, puts us in a position where now we're struggling with our identity. Why? Because we're in fight or flight. If your expression or your go-to emotion, and you are very kind, I know that from having met you, is to be a people pleaser, because that's how your emotional system or your defense system or your survival software believes you're going to be safe. Now what happens is it now starts to cause neural pathways to develop in your brain, which cause you to take on a identity, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's something that we do see all the time in chronic illness, and I think that's part of the identity that these patients need to develop in order to feel safe in the world, even though internally there's so much more happening that they may or may not even be aware of.
I really have to salute you for taking the brave approach you took at 18 years old to step up and now say, I'm going to take responsibility, right? I mean, that's very powerful. I mean, again, as somebody who's parented 4 children through that 18-year-old window, that's a difficult window to begin with, developmentally, and congratulations. That's really powerful. So now let's talk about how things went, right? So you sort of, tough young woman, gritting through these challenges. She gets through her early educational experience. She's working at a veterinary clinic. She's working at a chiropractic office. So spirit is moving you to this healing arena. You want to heal everyone in the family, mothers, fathers, children, dogs, cats, everybody. You're going to heal everyone. You're going to have this multiple disciplinary, multiple species practice. And then spirit takes you to a place where you're encouraged to go to a particular type of medical school that you didn't even know existed. So give us that, build that out for us.
Yeah. So, I remember my first biology class, and I just feel like I sat the whole class, and I know the listeners can't see me, but you can see my facial expression of just, drop down, mouth, jaw, and just eyes wide open. Like, this is the coolest thing I've ever heard. Right. And I'm just day after day coming to this class, just in love with it. And I found myself asking why, right? Why does the mitochondria do what, how does, and then how does it make proteins? How does it make hormones? Like, how is energy made? Like, okay, you're telling me on a superficial level, but how, And so then I started taking biochemistry, and then I really got into, the molecular chemical science behind how, and I just knew I was in the right place, that I was meant to understand how our bodies work in these innate machines, right? Our bodies are meant to heal themselves, and disease, right? It's a consequence of dysfunction of the function. And so, I was working in the veterinary clinic, and I've been an animal lover. I have, 2 dogs and a cat, and I wish I had 10. And through that, I really thought I found my calling, and I remember the first operation that I ever watched at the veterinary clinic was the veterinary's dog actually ate a tennis ball, and it got stuck in the intestines. And, she did an exploratory surgery to go and get it out. And I mean, sorry guys for the graphics, but she's pulling out the intestines and cutting them open. And while she's in there, I'm like, what's that? What's that? And she's showing me all the different organs, and I was just in love. I knew I found my calling there. But I knew there was something missing with medicine, and I think that's why naturopathic medicine really resonated to me, because having been, dismissed in childhood by these doctors, I think that my spirit just knew that there was another side of medicine that was missing. Giving a pill simply couldn't just fix everything. And I remember going to the exploration day and hearing about the tenets of naturopathic medicine, right? First, do no harm, and then treat the root cause. And I'm thinking about all of these pre-med classes I took, and I'm like, never did we talk about what is the root cause, right? and sitting in a couple of the classes and listening to the herbalism classes and listening to the foundational classes of understanding how disease and dysfunction develops in our body, I knew I was in the right place. I knew that I found a calling for myself that was going to allow myself to truly practice the type of medicine that I wanted to practice.
So you overcame the identity, you overcame the identity, and you found your identity. Science geek.
That's a great description. I get called that all the time.
So, so now let's talk about your journey through through medical school. How were you doing emotionally? How were you doing physically? And how did you finally come to your diagnosis? You did foreshadow that for us earlier that you were finally diagnosed with Lyme disease in your third year of medical school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I was really thinking back on this, and I realized that when I was, first sharing with you, I kind of left out a big part here, that I was actually originally diagnosed my first year of medical school. So,
Okay.
My first year of medical school, I realized I'm still sick. I realized I'm still having these abdominal attacks. I'm still having anxiety. Wow, I have a lot of fatigue. And I realized, I don't view myself as an intelligent person. I view myself as a hard worker, right? And so,
I
whereas
view
these
you,
others,
I view you as an intelligent person.
well, I appreciate it, and there's my identity coming out again, right? But when I would sit in these classes with these other students who would just, listen to the lecture and take the test and do good, I'd spend 6-7 hours at home studying, right? And I realized, wow, I think that there might be actually something here that I need to go see a naturopath myself. Believe it or not, I've never seen a naturopath going to naturopathic medical school. And so I started to see a naturopath, and that was the first time I actually got a diagnosis of Lyme disease. Was she had just ran some basic testing through LabCorp and Quest, and I actually had CDC positive, IgM positive, Lyme disease and Bartonella through Quest. And at that point, she treated me herbally, and I felt a lot better. I got
So,
better pretty quickly.
was that the first time Lyme disease was ever discussed with you? I mean, you went to, again, you have a very supportive family, you have a very supportive mother. We did salute her before. She was taking you to different types of doctors for a long period of time. At any point, did any doctor that you had any contact with suggest to you, hey, young Melanie, or soon to be Dr. Stein, did, is Lyme disease, have you ever been bit by a tick? You're an outdoorsy gal, you were a camper. I mean, was there any of that?
No, never, not once. I'd never even known what it was. As a matter of fact, I remember when I got this test back, I went home and I did a bunch of research on it. And my first thought was, no way, these must be false positives, but throughout treating, all of a sudden, feeling better, having less joint pain, having better cognition, energy, my stomach symptoms got better. And, I couldn't help but deny that it was there. But at that point in time, I still didn't know that my future would be so centered around this disease. I got better, and I continued on in school, and I loved school. I embraced myself with every aspect of it. I lived, breathed, and slept medical school. And, it was actually at a Qigong retreat during my third year when my life really changed.
Okay, so let's pause there for a second, because Matt's going to take you through the diagnosis in your first year and then what happened in your third year and everything in between, because our listeners are going to want to hear from you all of the different specific treatments that you used and why you used them and how they worked or didn't work. So Matt is going to take you through all that. But before I hand you over to Matt, I still have some more questions I need to ask you. So,
All right.
so there's sort of two different lines that I want to develop with you. The first is, do you believe that the naturopathic doctor that you finally treated with when you were first year medical student treated you differently and with more respect because you were a medical student and you were a colleague, and therefore she was it a she? I guess it was a she.
Yeah, it was a she. It was a she.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That she was not going to be likely to gaslight you as a result of the new status that you had as a medical student.
Absolutely not. No. Now I could say different about the neurologist later in life, but no, this little did I know that this naturopath actually was a Lyme specialist when I went to her. But No, she is an incredible physician. Dr. Jennifer Means, I hold her in such high esteem to this day. She really truly listened to me, listened to her patients, and I did a lot of IV therapy with her, and sat in this IV room where I saw other patients getting the same exact treatment that she gave me. And so I truly believe that she is an example of how doctors should treat their patients.
Okay. So you did hint earlier that that you were told by some of the doctors you treated with during your youth that your disease was all in your head.
Mhm.
Outline that for us. When did that happen? How did that happen? And what impact did that have on you?
Yeah. You know, I have more distinct memories of it, in my acute neurological Lyme state, but when I was younger, I remember saying things, in the hospital, like, no, something's wrong with my stomach, and them saying, nothing's wrong with your stomach, you just need to take a Xanax, you have anxiety, right? Or um no, mom, like, I don't want to go to school today, I'm having a lot of pain, or things like that. And it was like, honey, you're just anxious, you should go to school. And again, mom, thank you, I know you're going to listen to this later, I know you were just trying to do your best, but these were the beliefs that were put on us at a young age. And I think it messed with me. I mean, how could it not, right? I knew internally there was something wrong with how my body's function was expressing itself. And I didn't feel listened to. I didn't feel like anyone took the time to look at, was there something deeper going on?
So, one of the things again to be, forgiving of parents, and I often want to defend parents as one myself, is that, one of the things that we know is that the way our children will grow is through social and educational experiences that are stressful, right? How we get stronger is through stress. How we develop physically, how we develop emotionally, how we develop
Absolutely.
neurologically is through stress. And sometimes children are trying to avoid those stresses and the growth that comes from those stresses by not wanting to go to school, right? And we're always trying to sort of strike that balance between, are they really sick? Are they not really sick? Are they trying to avoid something? What is it, right? So, to join you in saluting your mom, she was doing her best, right? And I think almost all parents do their best. Certainly all mothers do their best. Dads generally have some more struggles with that. And we talked about that in this podcast on a number of different occasions where, dads generally fall short,
Right.
even when their children are diagnosed.
Well, and I think to further extend that, physicians can only do their best, and physicians can only diagnose us with the tools in which they are given. And, you know, I I
Yeah.
don't necessarily view all these doctors with ignorance. I view it as a lack of education, right? It's a lack of education of, how do we dig deeper when patients come in and they don't present in our classic algorithm state that we learn in medical school?
Yeah, and of course the algorithm or the frameworks that they learn in medical school do not include Lyme disease, right? I mean, on
Right.
some level, I think it was just fortuitous, for you, or a part of the journey that you were supposed to be on, where you arrived to a naturopathic doctor who was Lyme educated, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many people we've had on this podcast, how many doctors we've had on this podcast who said that they were treating patients in the Lyme endemic community. They went to a Lyme disease conference like ILADS. They take a course with Dr. Horowitz, approach Horowitz and say to Dr. Horowitz, "Hey, I think I may have some Lyme patients where I'm treating." And he's like, "Oh no, you have many." And she goes back and now finds thousands and thousands of Lyme disease patients that clearly had existed before she learned the Lyme frameworks, but just didn't have the capacity to diagnose.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that's something that I just really stand for now with who I am now, is educating, right? That's why I'm so excited to be on this podcast and, want to be lecturing. And Dr. Smells and I are actually teaching, a whole curriculum at the Naturopathic College on Lyme disease now, because it is here. It's just becoming worse. And we need to continue to teach our physicians to, at the very least, look for it, diagnose it, and then send to someone that knows how to treat it.
All right, so now you and I paused at this window between your initial diagnosis during your first year of medical school and then the conference that you had gone to, where you were third year, and
Mhm.
how it developed again. So Matt's going to take you through now the
Okay.
treatment journey now that you've had sort of this dual diagnosis?
Thanks,
About
Rich.
time, Rich. All I have to say. All right. So,
Well, I'm sorry, I couldn't give up someone I love to talk to, Matt.
all right. So, Dr. Stein, if you could, because I really want to get into what you did to treat Lyme disease personally, but also what you're doing now in your clinic to treat other patients. So, if you could just quickly highlight for us the progression of illness and your diagnosis, and then, the beginning of what you did to treat, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important to not skip details at the beginning of the story here. My third year of medical school, I was on a Qigong retreat and I woke up paralyzed. We stayed in these little huts and I was in this hut all alone. And I woke up and I couldn't get up. And I was able to move just enough to send a text to one of my friends that said, "Hey, I need you," and it was probably the scariest experience of my life. I didn't know what was happening with me. I didn't know why I couldn't move. I didn't know, I mean, just to be gross, I had feces all over me. I didn't get it. And I had a really good friend that was there that came and he helped me stand up, and I had complete full body tremors. I could barely move my legs. I could barely move my arms. He got me in the shower and he showered me and he got me in a car and took me to the hospital. And, the reason I don't want to skip anything is because my hospital journey was one of the most traumatic experiences I've ever had in my life. And I think it's really important to bring awareness about it because I do not want anyone to have to go through, what I went through. And, at first when I got there, right, they took me seriously. They did, MRIs and CT scans and all different types of scans in order to try to figure out what was happening with me. And all of them came back normal. And I remember at one point literally crying, begging for them to give me something to just calm down my tremors, and at this point, right, third year medical student, I'm shouting out all sorts of drugs that I know they can give me. And they told me I was drug seeking. And I said, "Are you kidding me? Like, give me a UA. Like, I do not please, I am in so much pain from these tremors at this point. I'm just sitting here, my whole body is just shaking. Please give me something to calm me down." And, I have this memory of the neurologist coming in and he stood me up and he just let me fall to the floor. And I was crying, being like, "Can you please help me up?" And he goes, "Get up." And I said, "What do you mean get up?" And listen, if anyone knows me, I'm a feisty, Rich, we didn't really talk about this, but my family's from Massachusetts. So I'm a feisty little East Coaster at heart, so I'm sitting here to this doctor saying, "What the F, who do you think you are?" And my wife at the time as well, we're yelling at this neurologist, like, someone needs to help me up off the floor. And, I was hyper reflexive and he was, going to do my reflexes. Then he would try to fake me out, as if he was trying to catch me faking my hyperreflexia. And, it was just a terrible, terrible experience. And they had a neuropsychologist come in and talk to my wife and my mom and say, what is going on with her life? Why is she choosing to do this? The diagnosis is convergent disorder. And
What does that mean, convergent disorder? Can you describe that?
yeah, so it's basically a diagnosis that says we don't know what is going on with you, but there's some sort of psychological process that is happening that is causing you to believe and manifest physically with these symptoms. That's really all they know about it. They, in my head, it's basically another way of saying it's all in your head. You're choosing to do this. My wife at the time, she basically said to them, "You don't know Melanie. There is not a chance that this is something she is choosing to do. We need more answers. You need to do more testing. This is the most stubborn, independent individual that you will ever meet. Figure it out," and they basically said, "We've ran out of options for testing. We're going to send her home." And she said, "What do you mean you're going to send her home? She can't walk. Are you going to get her a wheelchair? What's home health going to do?" No. And, my mom and my wife really had to fight and advocate and even fight insurance to get me sent into a rehab facility. And, at this point, basically, it was almost as if I was basically being told, this is all in your head. You're choosing to be in a wheelchair now. We don't have any tools or medications we're going to give you. You're on your way. And, at that point, I developed a bullseye rash. And I don't know if I had the bullseye rash before that or if the bullseye rash, came out a couple days later. I was in this hospital for about 10 days and, but I saw it. And, again, right. Third year medical school. I knew at this point, I had a previous diagnosis of Lyme. I knew what that was. And I called the doctor and I said, I have Lyme disease. Like, I have acute neurological Lyme disease. I need IV antibiotics right now. And it was, no, we don't have any Lyme out here. You haven't traveled, that's not a bullseye rash. And again, right. It was an atypical bullseye rash, but I can share pictures of it where any Lyme doctor would look at that and say, nope, that's a bullseye rash. And again, they refused to treat me. And, so anyways, they, my wife and my mom, got me over to this new rehab facility, and we called my naturopath who was treating me for Lyme. I hadn't seen her in a year, and we called her and told her what happened. And she said, stop here on the way. I want to draw your blood. And, she did. And once again, I had an IgM positive Lyme test, and we got that test back as I'm in this rehab where, again, right. I'm being told, let's teach you how to live your life in a wheelchair, because now you're in a wheelchair and we don't know why.
Dr. Stein, I just to quickly interrupt, an IgM positive Lyme test by your naturopathic doctor means you have a recent infection of Lyme disease, correct?
Correct. There is some argument that says that there's persistent IgM elevation, right? But
right.
Or
worse, an active infection in your body with Lyme disease based on that blood test, right? Potentially
exactly.
and likely a recent reinfection of Lyme disease, most likely, right? So my question there is, did they do any of these tests at the hospital? I mean, when you brought up Lyme, did they do them? And what happened there?
Refused to. They refused to. When I was in the hospital and I showed them the bullseye rash, I was entirely dismissed, saying Lyme's not here in Oregon.
Got it.
And once I got this IgM positive test, I'm thinking to myself, surely they're going to treat me now, right? And so they brought in an infectious disease doctor, and he sat down to me, and I will never forget his.
Wait, you went back to the hospital after going back to your naturopath?
So the rehab facility I was in was within this other hospital.
Got it.
So I had a care team. I had a care team, that was treating me at this point, right? So I get this email from my naturopath that says, show this to them, look, and so I call them in, and, they come in, and I'm like, they bring in infectious disease, and he looks at me, and, he puts his hand on his chin, and he goes, there's two worlds to Lyme disease. There's people who believe in it, and there's people who don't. And I looked at him and I said, so you're telling me that I'm what was I at the time? 26-year-old female who is acutely, neurologically degenerative, in a wheelchair, tremors, can't live for herself, function for herself. I have a classic bullseye rash. Now I have an IgM positive test. You can't come with any other explanation of what's wrong with me. But because you don't believe in Lyme disease, you're counting this test as a false positive, and you're not going to provide me treatment. And, basically he said yes. And, that's when, I was not in a good mental place. I'm going to be honest. I was extremely suicidal at this point. I'm this young woman who's in this rehab facility, nothing against, the geriatric population, but with, post-stroke geriatric patients who are, ringing their bell for help to get out of bed. And they, like, no one's coming to help us go to the bathroom. Right. And I called my wife and I said, get me the hell out of here. Get me out of here. And I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this. I don't care. I'm in a wheelchair. Get them to get me a wheelchair and we'll figure it out together. And they had another neuropsychologist come in and talk to me about, like, what was I doing? Why was I leaving? I need to figure out what's wrong with me. And I straight up just said, F you. F you, I have Lyme disease. If you can tell me something else that I have, I'll listen, but this is not all in my head. And so I kind of escaped, I left.
But they were going to help you anyway. So, I don't, looking back, I don't think that was a bad decision by any means, right? Because I'm sure the steps that came next resulted in you getting better treatment and to being where you are today, which was, absolutely the right thing that you could have done. So walk us through what happened next. Now you leave the hospital. Sounds like you're wheelchair bound. What quality of life do you have, and what are you doing to get proper treatment for what you know to be Lyme disease?
Yeah. I mean, quite frankly, it felt like I had no quality of life. again, I've mentioned a couple of times, I'm a pretty independent, stubborn human. And, I couldn't even go to the bathroom by myself. I couldn't even lift myself off of the wheelchair to transfer at this point. Nothing. I could not do anything but lay there, and tremor. And, again, like this is, I will praise Dr. Jennifer Means through and through. She got me IV antibiotics, and she wrote letter upon letter to insurance companies to get them to cover the IV antibiotics. And, it was a very long journey. I was in a wheelchair for 3 years fighting this. And I'm very thankful for IV antibiotics, but, there was many different modalities along the way that I did, that ultimately led to my recovery.
So Dr. Stein, quickly, do you recall what specific IV antibiotics you used? Was it one, or was it a combination throughout that couple year window?
Yeah, so at first it was IV Rocephin, right? Which is kind of classic acute neurological Lyme. That's what you do. Over time, I ended up doing IV azithromycin as well. And that one was really hard. I think you guys probably know we talk about die-off a lot. We talk about herxing, and I am the classic, sensitive patient who herxes. You name it, I've experienced it. And, every time I did IV azithromycin, I would have a seizure. And, I remember my doctor at this point, I kind of moved on. I'm kind of skipping here through the story, but at this point, I actually came to ILADS one year in a wheelchair. And I met Dr. Tom Messenger through that process. And I think that through my mental health, the one thing that got me through was that I was now going to be a Lyme doctor, and I was going to learn how to fight this, and I was going to learn how to treat this, because I was going to make sure no one was ever treated the way I was in that hospital.
Were you still going to school in a wheelchair to finish your naturopathic medical degree?
I was.
Talk about courage and strength and bravery. My goodness.
Yep, I was. And I mean, it was, I really believe it's the only reason that I'm still alive, is that it was my purpose. It was my meaning. And, the school did not make it easy. I'm not going to lie. I had to really fight the institution as well, that nope, I could still be a doctor, and nope, you guys need to give me an alternative, path to graduating. It took me 7 years instead of 4 years to graduate. But, no, I was still going to school, and again, right, my wife would drop me off at school every day. She would come in and she would move the tables and the chairs and bring me up to my class. And I'd sit there in class and come home and then do my treatment. And yeah.
All right. So 3 years, you're wheelchair bound, treating Lyme with your naturopathic doctor. You did IV Rocephin and IV azithromycin from an antibiotic standpoint. And you did that for how long, the antibiotic? I just want to make sure I had that right.
Yeah. I was probably on IV antibiotics for about 2-3 years.
Okay.
In full.
What other were you doing anything with your naturopathic doctor at the time? And obviously, you learning what you're learning in school. What were you doing to help the die-off, detox, and support your body otherwise to reduce or lessen the herxes that you were having, or the Herxheimer reactions you were having from the massive die-off of the bacteria?
So that's something that I think is really important. I was kind of excited to talk about today, because nothing. And I think that there is a view by many Lyme doctors that you treat it hard and you herx, and that's the only way to get better. Right. And I think that there's a paradigm shift happening right now, and something that, I really feel is very, very important. And a key part of my practice today as a naturopathic physician is walking alongside these patients. And, I described this teeter-totter, approach of what is a herx, right? We're stirring up inflammation. That alone delays recovery and prolongs disease process. And so, at that point in time, nothing. And that is like, the number one reason why it is such a big practice for me now to walk my patients through, how do we herx? What do we do? When is it too much? Right. Because I didn't have any of that. And I remember a conversation one day that my doctor had with myself and my wife at the time, that said, okay, when she starts to have a seizure with the IV azithromycin, pause it, wait for the seizure to end, and then start it again.
I cannot wait to get into with you the tools you're doing today and what you've learned. But before we get there, I want to focus on what other things were you doing in that 3-year window of being wheelchair bound and using IV antibiotics to treat Lyme, if anything? I think you mentioned earlier there were some other modalities you did too, and I want to make sure we touch on those.
Yeah, sure. So, I did IV ozone. I did a lot of IV major auto chemotherapy as well. And I loved that. I felt so good after I did the IV ozone. Um, so I did that twice a week for a really long time. I don't know how much I do think it was killing the infections, but I know that it helped me symptomatically manage. It got me out of pain. It helped with my energy. I did a lot of different herbs, our classic herbs, right? Cryptolepis, Hatunia, cat's claw, Sita acuta. I did a lot of the Beyond Balance tinctures for a while because I was so sensitive. That was a great way to help, do something herbally that didn't cause as much herxing. And one of the therapies that, we can talk here in a little bit, that 2 years ago, my symptoms kind of relapsed and my seizures came back. But one of the most profound therapies I did was cell membrane stabilization therapy. And I feel like that was the therapy that, since I have done that, I really truly feel as though I am now, what I would consider a healthy individual in full remission.
Okay, but you did that 2 years ago, correct? The cell membrane stabilization therapy.
Mhm.
Okay.
But along the way, what got me out of a wheelchair, like if
Yeah.
we're going to kind of talk about treatments, it was ivermectin actually. So ivermectin, I did 3 months of ivermectin, and I had some of the worst herxing of my life on ivermectin. And I would start it and then I would stop it because I would just feel so horrible and I needed to go to school. But finally, I want to say I did 3 straight weeks of ivermectin, and that's when my tremors really started to calm down.
Why do you believe that is? I mean, ivermectin, there's a lot of claims about ivermectin and obviously a lot of drama and conflict. And I mean, it was even called out in RFK's post right before Trump won the election. And, again, politics aside, RFK, I think, has a lot of views that I hope he follows through with as far as, what he plans to do in America, right? I mean, he talked about ivermectin, he talked about stem cells, he talked about, nutraceuticals, he talked about, all kinds of different medicines, hydroxychloroquine that can help people and have helped so many people in the Lyme community. So, what are your views as to why ivermectin is helpful? Do you think it's because it has such a strong, broad antiviral and antibacterial perspective? And if you're treating with a particular antibiotic, it might not be hitting things that are also active in your system and it's just too much overwhelming you? Like, what's your view as to why that was so effective for you, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I think it does make sense. I mean, I think there's 2 aspects to it, right? I mean, if we date back to these GI attacks I had as a kid, right? And my history of, God knows what I drank as a kid going camping, right? There is a part of me that wonders if the ivermectin treated some of these other aspects of pathogenic, load in my body, such as maybe parasites, viruses, bacteria. But, we can't deny, right? It's immune system modulating approaches too, right? It does incredible work on the immune system. And that's a big part of my practice today is, we treat these pathogens and, absolutely we need to get rid of them. We need to treat them. But the effects that Lyme has on the immune system is very well studied, right? It completely discombobulates our whole immune system. And so, I do wonder if part of it was really starting to re-regulate my immune system, because after that, I started to respond to treatments better.
That I couldn't agree more, and I think that I'm so glad you answered that way because that was so well said, and I think that really makes a lot of sense. Another question I would ask you is: we have so many doctors come on and say antibiotics all the way, and I won't say, and I'm sure we all know the doctors, right? Some of them are ILADS doctors, well, they are ILADS doctors. Antibiotics all the way. We have other people come on and say no antibiotics, they're bad, herbals only. Then we have others come on and say, I'm more in the middle, but maybe not antibiotics unless we really need them, but we'll do things like ivermectin, other things that are more pharmaceutical with a more natural approach. But, I'm of the opinion, whatever works for a patient, right? And for me, it was both. I had to do antibiotics, I had to do some prescriptions, and I had to do some herbs to really get me where I wanted to be. So what is your view as both a patient and now an expert Lyme doctor as far as, does it really matter? Antibiotics, herbs, right? Because people, look, we did a post last week on a study about doxycycline, and, it was just insane. I mean, we had hundreds of comments. I didn't think it was going to cause this much conflict in the Lyme community, but people were jumping up and down saying antibiotics are the devil. And if you think they're good for Lyme, you're stupid and you shouldn't do it. I mean, it was really, I'm being dramatic, but it was pretty hostile in the comments. So there are 2 strong positions here. And where do you stand in that?
Yeah, I think that this is the hot topic of debate, right? And for me, I went to naturopathic school. we learned that you give an antibiotic as an absolute last resort. And when you do, you give it as short as you can, right? And we also learn first do no harm and treat the root cause, right? And so in my eyes, I use more antibiotics and pharmaceuticals for that matter than I ever thought I was going to use going into naturopathic medical school. And when I talk to my patients, like right when we first get their first like IGeneX, Vibrant Wellness, T-Lab test back, and we see this diagnosis of Lyme disease, I have this exact conversation with them, right? And I think at the end of the day, I stand right in the middle. I think that it's really about what do our patients respond to and what gets our patients better, and part of being a naturopathic physician is we have so many tools in our toolbox that we can support the bodily systems if we do need to use antibiotics. Because if we are using antibiotics, right, we're often using them for months, if not years. And so how can we support the GI tract, support the brain, support, not developing antibiotic resistance, and use these antibiotics in a safe way, treating the root cause?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you touched on a few labs, right? Like Vibrant and T labs. Can you speak to the labs that you recommend for Lyme patients, and if any of them, have any kind of insurance coverage at all? Because a question we get asked all the time is, look, we've interviewed obviously IGeneX and Armin Labs and Galaxy, and we've had all the big ones on. But what do you use in your practice? Because these tests can be expensive, right? And what is your view on that?
Right. Yeah, they are expensive, and that's one of the battles that I have every day, right? Is being sick is expensive, and oftentimes being sick, you can't work. It's horrible because no, these labs aren't covered by insurance. I use many different labs. I'm a tried and true IGeneX, fan personally. I think that knowing the owners, they are really at the forefront of the research with Lyme disease. They really care. And, they just got their immunoblot approved by FDA, the FDA. And I'm really hoping that that will pave the way to more, hospitals and therefore insurance companies starting to accept these specialized testing, parameters to, sorry, I lost my thought there, really getting these big organizations to accept this and start to cover it. Because for our listeners who don't know, right, the reason you can't just go to a basic lab through LabCorp and Quest that your insurance is going to cover is because they are looking at the test in a different way. They are looking at different proteins that these organisms secrete on their surface and not testing all of them that we really do need to make a Lyme disease diagnosis.
Yeah, I mean, I would love the day where somebody can go to a doctor and say, hey, I have these symptoms. The doctor suspects Lyme, and they can do an IGeneX test, right, by sending them to their local lab, right? I mean, I think that would be wonderful, or a better specialized lab. Look, we do it with other types of diseases and illnesses. You go to a rheumatologist and they're testing you for something that is an autoimmune disease. They have specialty labs to test for certain specialty autoimmune diseases. So the same could be true of Lyme, and I'm really hopeful for that. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think that IGeneX is working towards that, and hopefully in our lifetimes we'll see that. I mean, that's something that we can be hopeful for. So talk to us about, you kind of walked us through that 3-year window. So I want to be clear, was there anything else that got you out of the wheelchair? The IV Rocephin, the azithromycin, the IV ozone, all the herbs, crypto, cat's claw, Beyond Balance blends, all that kind of stuff. You did the ivermectin, which was your game changer and got you out of the wheelchair. Anything else noteworthy before we get on to life after, when, the post wheelchair life?
Yeah. I think that, getting out of the wheelchair, I think that really covers it. After I got out of the wheelchair, I was then in a walker and then in a cane, right? Before I before I was able to kind of live what I call a relatively healthy lifestyle for many years. So I think leading up to getting out of the wheelchair, that really covers it all.
Okay. So now talk to us about life post wheelchair. And you said walker and cane, right? What's your health like? Are you doing anything different from a treatment standpoint, or are you just persisting with the current protocol and just making gains, along the way? I just want to hear, the next step of your Lyme journey here.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I stayed on the same protocol, changing up the herbs every once in a while, but, continuing to get IV ozone, IV nutrients, IV antibiotics. But a lot of it from this point was regaining strength and mobility and learning how to walk again, because me getting out of a wheelchair did not mean I did not have tremors anymore, right? It meant that I learned how to walk with these tremors. And, I remember, my ex-wife, she was a stubborn one too, right? So she would take me outside and we would use the the lines in the cement as goals, right? So we go outside in the wheelchair and she'd say, okay, today you're going to walk to this line, and I literally had to take it step by step by step, still tremoring, but lifting my foot slowly to get to that first line. And then, oh man, by the time I got to that first line, I just sat down on that walker and, smiled, but I was like, oh, and so it wasn't just that, right? It was the muscular atrophy at that point too, that I had to regain strength and, learn literally how to walk again. And, over time throughout continued treatment, my tremors did die down. For the most part, we stayed on the same treatment. I think at one point I did some IV doxy, I did some IV Bactrim at one point, but my gut was just so sensitive that I really needed to stay on the IVs for antibiotics, and continued on with therapy until over time, I switched to a cane, and my, pretty much all of my symptoms went away except pain. I could truthfully say that I've never really gotten out of pain.
So talk to us about the things that you got introduced after, right? Because you mentioned earlier about the cell membrane stabilization therapy, but I think before that, from just kind of knowing a little bit about you and reading up on you, you mentioned that the IV phosphatidylcholine was extremely helpful for you as well, right? That was another game changer. So can you speak to that and when that fit into your journey here?
Yeah. So, so I ended up taking a year off between medical school and practicing. And, I think it is important to note that I think I moved out of a moldy home at that point, and I think that that's when my symptoms really got better and the treatment really just started working.
Sorry, sorry, can we pause there for 1 second? Because I really want to ask you a fun question there and just take a quick side road, okay? Because I just love having these fun, theoretical conversations just with you. So the first, it is, you were in a moldy home, you weren't doing well, you remove yourself from the moldy home, and all of a sudden, boom, you start doing a lot better. Same treatment, right? But you remove yourself from the toxic mold. Now, we know everybody's different. Everybody detoxes mold differently. Our genetics, our microbiome, right? Our overall health, all of those things matter when it comes to how we can detox mold. And then, of course, the strains of mold, right? What is it, right? But now, my question for you is, do you believe people that are having mold exposure, once they get themselves into a healthier place, can live a life where they can be around mold periodically without having severe health setbacks? Because I often hear from guests that come on this podcast that are on the patient side, not the doctor side, that they have this like PTSD where they lived in mold. It was, really holding them back. They finally got to detox the mold, realized and remediated their home, but now they're afraid to go to like a friend's house or, a place in work, a closet at work, or, certain facilities or movie theaters because of mold. Do you think that's really extreme? Like, what is your view? Because I want to believe that our bodies can become strong enough and that, minimal exposure can be managed once we get to a certain level of health. But what are your views on that?
Yeah, so I'm a shoemaker trained doc, and so when we look at the SIRS pathway and we look at the, inflammatory response that our bodies have when you have this genetic predisposition to reacting to mold, not an allergy reaction like a lot of us think, but more of this long-term inflammatory reaction. And, we look at Dr. Navio's work of the cell danger response of, as we have this continued exposure, our bodies get placed in this cell danger response, right? And sicker quicker. So, when we're in our acute healing stage, I do believe you need to avoid mold, because every other mold exposure is going to trigger that cell danger response. It's going to trigger those inflammatory markers, and we're going to just get sicker. Now,
what's the difference between, I'm sorry, I just want to ask a question before I forget. What is the difference between a mold allergy and this, inflammatory response, this cell danger response you referred to? Because I feel like they're two different categories that I want to better define and understand on this interview.
Sure. So in our body, when we react to different, whether it's toxins or pathogens, we have different ways that our body releases these proteins and chemical mediators or biomediators in the body of how our immune system responds. One of those is IgE, right? Immunoglobulin E, which is this allergic response. And so this is what we think about with anaphylaxis, or, when our face puffs up, our throat gets tight, right? This is where we cause our mast cells to release histamine. We can get hives, right? A true allergic response. And so a lot of people that have, maybe more IgE responses to mold, maybe they're not having that anaphylactic reaction, but they might have other histamine, symptoms such as runny nose, cough, things like that. Now, there's another type of reaction, an IgG reaction. And that is more of the reaction that we get, right, with Lyme disease or things like that, right? Where now our body is releasing inflammatory mediators like C4A or TGF beta 1, where we're getting decreased oxygen perfusion to the tissue, increased inflammation. We're starting to change our protein makeup in our body, leading to more symptoms that are systemic, right? Chronic fatigue, gastrointestinal symptoms, hormone dysregulation, less of those allergy type symptoms that I described about before.
Thank you. I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but there's so many, I feel like, gold nuggets here we got to talk about. And also Dr. Shoemaker, of course, being one of the lead mold specialists that everybody in the Lyme community sort of defers to. You were trained by him, which is why I really wanted to make sure we explore all this with you. So apologies again for interrupting. If you want to keep going on with what you were saying.
No, I can talk about this all day. Can you help me kind of get back on track?
Yeah, so I was saying you were kind of saying that when you're at the acute phase of the illness of Lyme, we need to avoid mold at all costs, because that small trigger can really set us back and prevent us from healing. And I think you're going to go into saying maybe when we get more stable, what your views were.
Yeah, so my stables are truly mixed on this. I do believe that there are some people who have extreme sensitivities to mold, and they do need to avoid mold. I personally can't help but believe in our body's function to heal, right? And this kind of gets us into the cell membrane therapy that I'm going to talk about with the phospholipids of, after school, I started working for this Dr. Werner Voslow, right? I mentioned him at the beginning. He's who I bought the clinic from. And, he's really a pioneer in this therapy of re-regulating our cellular environment, right? These toxins, they can change our epigenetic expression of our genes, and they can change how proteins made, how our mitochondria is able to make energy. And so, I can't help but believe if we can heal ourselves on a cellular level, if we can truly heal our immune systems, that gets into kind of my last step approach with Lyme disease is, we need to work on the immune system damage that happens from Lyme in order to prevent relapse in the future. Right. And so, I can't help but be a believer that if we can actually do this work on this deeper cellular genetic level, that yes, these patients, maybe they can't live in a really moldy home because they have the genetics that predisposes them to, getting stuck in this cell danger response long term. But could they go to a restaurant? Could they go to work? Could they go to their friend's house and not have these extreme reactions? Absolutely.
Yep. I mean, I just had a conversation with a colleague today who said, hey, I avoid this one office because there's got to be mold in there. And every time I go in there, I get a runny nose. And we're talking about this, right? And I thought, it's interesting because he's a generally healthy man, right? Not knowing what we know, not knowing, how deep my health issues have been in my life. But I thought, hey, I go in that office all the time and I'm never fearful. And, I'm not in there for 10 days straight, but I'll go in there for a few hours and I don't feel any sort of, really major setbacks. And I never really thought about if I have a runny nose or anything. But to me, it's sort of I think once you get to a healthy enough place, you'll know because your body will tell you and you'll listen to the signals your body is giving you. But also we can't be fearful of things because that's going to compromise our immune system as well and make us even more vulnerable, right? So I think it's just that weird combination there. But
and I think it's a hard interplay, right? Between we do a lot of limbic system work in my practice too, right? And so how can we calm our limbic systems down enough that if we do have a little bit of a mold exposure, maybe we do have a little bit of a runny nose, right? We're not going to then let our limbic systems go to this point of like, I need to get out of here right now. Oh my gosh, I'm going to get sick again. But also, right, we've talked a lot in this podcast about honoring our emotions and honoring the signals that our body's saying. And so finding this interplay between, no, this is a place I can't be because it's causing illness, and overexpression of our nervous system sympathetic response, right?
No doubt, right? And I think you just clarified a misconception I had earlier, which was your cell membrane stabilization therapy is really the IVPC, right? The phosphatidylcholine that I was talking about earlier. I think they're one and the same. They're not separate. Is that correct?
They are the same. Correct.
Okay. So can you just explain what is IV phosphatidylcholine, and then why is that also called cell membrane stabilization therapy? Like what really it is, and break it down in simple words for our listeners, please.
Yeah, sure. So phosphatidylcholine, it's a lipid. It's a fat in our body that makes up the majority of the backbones of our cell membranes. So our cell membranes are made up of a fatty structure of many different types of fats: phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylethynolamine, and cardiolipin being the three most abundant fats in our cell membrane. And what happens in our cell membrane is that as it's exposed to toxins over time, it gets replaced with an oxidized, thick, waxy form of fat called malonylaldehyde, right? And so the idea on a rather superficial level of what the cell membrane therapy is doing is it's restructuring, reorganizing the cellular membrane, as well as healing our DNA. You know, there's adducts that can actually bind to our DNA. You know, there's studies of alpha toxin. There's actually a study with Lyme binding to the DNA and changing the methylation and acetylation. That's how our genes are expressed, right? Changing the proteins that are made, changing the hormones that are made. And so really healing these cell membranes and cleansing our cells of these toxins so that our body can now function in homeostasis, right? I mean, I believe it's Dr. Navio who says our cells can only do what they can do, what they're capable of.
Yeah, and anybody listening knows, and you know Dr. Stein as well. We love Dr. Rolls, and he's all about. I mean, his last book was Cellular Health, right? It was all about that, herbs and how to rebuild cellular health and mitochondrial strength, and really, you know, cellular resiliency, so you can have that sort of maintenance and not have to worry about relapses, but also rebuild from like the core up, right? I do have a follow-up question to this and the whole PC cell membrane stuff, but I do want to ask. We hear it all the time. We hear about epigenetics. We hear about our DNA. And we hear about toxins and things like Lyme being able to bind to it and then change our DNA. But can you give us like, and I know it's a really hard question because it's a very complex topic. And if you're not a scientist and you're not a doctor, you know, like you are, it's hard to understand. Is there an example you can think of in a way where Lyme attaches to DNA or something happens to DNA and changes the epigenetics? Kind of give us an example to better understand that concept.
Yeah. So, you know, I think it's important to not necessarily look at it as changing our DNA, but changing the expression of our DNA, right? So I'm going to do my best here. I haven't actually been asked this question before, so, you know, let me know how I do. But, you know, let's back up and talk a little bit about DNA, right? So DNA, it's made of different ribonucleotides, right? And what happens is our DNA is read, right? And it turns into something called messenger RNA, which is basically a transcription of it, right? It's a mirror image of this, you know, DNA. And that then gets taken to our mitochondria and that gets read again. And that is basically the recipe book for what hormones are we going to make? What proteins are we going to make, right? Hormones, we can talk about hormones as far as, you know, testosterone, estrogen, right? Physical health, but we can also talk about hormones in the sense of thyroid function, proteins, right? What is the job of proteins? Proteins make things happen in our body, right? They bind to different receptors in our body to tell it to do something. And so when we have things like Lyme or alpha toxin binding to these different regions of the DNA, right? Adding to the region, what's actually happening is it can, through the process of methylation and acetylation, change its expression. And so genes that were turned off before can now be turned on. You know, and Dr. Shoemaker is doing some of these studies right now with his Genie test of trying to identify different gene regions that are turned off and turned on through mold, right? Same thing with Lyme. And so what ends up happening is now that mRNA molecule that maybe said, hey, make testosterone, right? That mRNA molecule is being read differently. And so now when we get to that mitochondrial level, different proteins, different hormones are going to be made and expressed.
Okay, so I think I get it, and I think I have a follow-up question. And it might mean I don't get it based on the question, but essentially this DNA is sending messages, and these messages are being read by various components of our body, like cells, and then we're creating hormones, which are critical for us for our health, right? Testosterone, good chemicals, bad chemicals, right? Things, cortisol, whatever it might be, right? Now, my question to you is, we keep hearing that cellular health is key. And I understand that the membrane can be oxidized and it could be unhealthy, to keep it simple, right? And we have to repair that through things like, the cell membrane stabilization therapy you're talking about, and maybe herbal therapy, et cetera. But if our DNA is expressed differently because of toxins or pathogens, even if we strengthen the cell, if the DNA is sending a bad message to the cell, isn't the DNA the most base level? And aren't we still fundamentally flawed and susceptible to be sick, right? Does that make sense, or am I
Well,
misunderstanding the whole
no, I mean, I
concept?
think that's true. And I think that's why, PC is not the only answer, right? I think that's why there's still a role for these antimicrobial therapies within treatment, because, we need to get rid of the toxic exposure, right? If you look at the Shoemaker pathway, for instance, right? Or the cell danger response, let's, we could talk about it in two different ways. The very first step is removing the pathogen, right? We need to remove whatever is causing the dysfunction to begin with. And then once we remove the dysfunction, now we can repair.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So you're right. It's really not just the PCs helping rebuild the cell and the membrane, which is the power. It's really like, a really important component. But if we don't address the toxins and the pathogens impacting the DNA, then the messages are still going to be wrong, causing an imbalance of chemicals and hormones in our body. So yeah, it's really multifaceted. It's kind of what you just said, I think, right?
Yeah. And sometimes I will do the therapy concurrently with the treatment, right?
Yep.
Because at the same time, there's also the theory, right, but if our cells are not working, when we give you an antibiotic and we say, hey, please do this, then the cell goes, I don't know what to do, right?
Yep.
So there is something to also be said about, can we get to a point in therapy where we can turn on these cell signaling pathways better through the use of IVPC to then allow our modalities to work better too?
Yep, I get it, and I love it. And you are an amazing explainer. I mean, there are things you're explaining on this podcast that nobody has come close to explaining as well as you have. I mean, these are hard concepts. So, I mean, you're killing it. We're loving it. I mean, you could probably tell already by our reaction here. I think, and Rich is even jumping in. He never jumps in.
Can
I
we
see you jumping at your seat, Rich.
well, I wanted to talk about the genetics and the epigenetics, right? And one of the things that I'm passionate about when we're talking about husbanding resources and making sure that you're getting the best bang for your buck, because you're not going to be able to do everything, is to determine where you should start, in what order you should be doing things in, right? And one of the things that Matt and I have debated about before is genetic testing, right? And what's the value of genetic testing and when should we use it, right? And I think one of the challenges that we have in this community is understanding the difference between genetics and epigenetics. And I just want to get your take on that, right? Because I'm old enough to remember the Human Genome Project, right? And I remember when they talked about how they identified, the genetic code, and they had all these junk genes, right? These uncoded genes. And for a long time, they were just trying to figure out, like, why do we have all these uncoded genes and why do we have these junk genes? And as it turns out, they were just the uncoded genes, which then could become coded based on the germs that are now being spit into our system by these, by ticks, right? So when we're talking about this epigenetics and the expression of genes, right? What's happening is we have these genes that were once defined as junk genes and now defined as uncoded genes. Is they're now being coded, and as a result of these previously uncoded genes now being coded, they are now what's triggering this cell response that you were just defining.
Yeah, exactly. And when I think about genetic testing and where I do use it in my practice, is really when it comes to HLA markers with mold susceptibility. I think that understanding what our susceptibility to mold and Lyme and other toxins are can help us. And just to be honest, I think some of my office visits are simply just convincing the spouse that this patient is actually sick. Let's, talk about mold for an example, right? I know we're talking about Lyme, but, mold comes hand in hand with it these days. Why, I mean, Matt, we could go back to the argument of, why when you walk into this building, are you not getting those symptoms, but your friend is, right?
Yep.
And maybe it's because your limbic system's not going off, you're not looking for it, but maybe it's because you do not have this genetic predisposition to this IgG response being released, right?
So, but isn't that the question, Dr. Stein? Is it a genetic predisposition, meaning it is the way your genes were coded as a result of your birth? Or is it a genetic predisposition that's developed as a result of genes that were uncoded now being coded as a result of the infection?
Isn't that a question?
Yeah.
I think there could be argument in many ways. I mean, according to the work of Dr. Shoemaker, these are genes that are being expressed, right? I think the question remains as to whether or not that's due to as epigenetics or not, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I do think that there's a belief of, even just from our parents, right, what's passed down in utero, how much of our disease, is not even our burden that we needed to carry, right? I mean, I mentioned at the beginning, like, I do wonder if I actually contracted Lyme originally from a tick, or if I got it in utero. My
Or
father
both.
is a very healthy man and he has many of the symptoms that I had.
And you said your family is from the East Coast, right? So it's very
Yeah.
likely they were harboring the bacteria, and it's likely that it was passed on to you, and it was likely that you were able to manage that until you couldn't manage it because of a subsequent tick bite.
Correct. And so I guess the truth is I don't know how to answer that question, because I think it's still part of research that's being done. But I think that, with that being said, we can't deny the epigenetic influences. And, there was a research lab out of Germany that, since the founder has passed away and we're not able to obtain this lab anymore, but, this was one of my favorite labs, like seeing you could actually study the DNA adducts and the epigenetic changes that were happening on this genomic level, and seeing, they had a whole database that they were, doing research on what was bound. And you could see, mercury was bound to the cell at this region. And, oh, look, this exact region happened to a region that predisposes you to certain different inflammatory markers. And does that then led to your predisposition to when you got Lyme, why you got so sick, right? I think it's all still at the beginning forefronts of developmental research.
Yeah, but when we're making a decision about how we're going to spend our resources, the question really is it wise to be spending resources on genetic testing when there are other, maybe more effective
Yeah.
tools that will move the needle a lot more quickly, right?
I don't really do any genetic testing in my practice.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
So because I think if you're killing the bugs and you're removing your contact with mold, and you're bringing yourself to a place where you're cleaning up your diet, and you're moving, and you're working with a good therapist who's helping you to learn how to deal with the challenges that are coming along with the disease, and learn how to use your brain, that I think they will all move the needle much more. I think much more effectively than genetic testing. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that there's no value to it, but the places where we as humans are the most diverse is not in our genetics. I mean, genetically, we're really very
Right.
much alike.
We're rather similar, right?
Right. Where the diversity comes is in our gut and in our brain, right? I mean, our neural pathways are all going to be very diverse, and our microbiome is going to be very diverse. So if I was going to spend money on testing, again, I'm just an argument I'd like to hear your response
No,
to.
I think that you have a good point, and I think it's a conversation that I'm constantly having with my patients, right? Because
Yep.
again, this disease is a very expensive disease to have. And for me, when I think about testing that I'm asking my patients to do, I'm thinking about how is that going to guide treatment, right?
Yeah.
Because, for instance, I'm not really a big mycotoxin tester. If you have mold in your home, you're sick, you have mold in your body, why are we going to spend $400 every 3 months testing your mycotoxins, right? Like, I would rather see you invest that money towards treatment, right? Now, I think testing for Lyme disease is a great way to spend your money, because it can help us understand what infections do you have. If we understand what infections you have, then we can understand what antibiotics or what herbs are going to work best, right? So yeah.
No, look, I'm with you. And so my argument is that if it really is an epigenetic response, which is what I think Dr. Schumacher is suggesting, then if we remove the trigger for the epigenetic response, which is now treating the disease, that we're now defining through our through our Lyme testing, then trying to like in a research setting, look, it would be wonderful to do all of that genetic and epigenetic testing, because then maybe we can see the trigger between Babesia and a certain epigenetic expression, and Bartonella and a certain epigenetic expression, and then determine how that expression is now having an impact, right? But I think if we have limited resources and we're going to be focusing on limited resources, I'm with you, Dr. Stein. I really think it's testing for the germs and the bugs, so that we can now direct our treatment, testing for mold and direct our treatment, and now move forward with making the lifestyle changes that we make, which I'm guessing, and I'm not a scientist or a doctor, but I'm guessing that then the epigenetic expression is probably not going to have the impact that it's having, because we're taking out all of the toxins.
Yeah, no, I would actually 100% agree with that statement. And, I think that, Dr. Voslo, he said this so beautifully at his presentation at ILADS this year, which was, in, 30% of our patients, when we use the tools that we have, we give the antibiotics, we give the, the herbs, they get better, right? And it's, what do we do when they don't get better, right?
Yep.
And so I think that's really where this therapy shines.
Look, and I think you said it really well earlier, Dr. Stein. You keep coming back to this, which is it's not a simple thing, right? It's never just going to be Lyme. It's, there's mold as a component. One treatment's not going to work. It's not just about the cell. It's about your DNA as well. It's about the pathogen. It's about the mold. It's the heavy metals. I mean, look, I just learned a fascinating fact today. So, Rich and I live very close to each other, and this area that I grew up with that was called the Davis Peach Farm was when it was going to be sold. A big commercial developer came in, studied the soil, and determined it had astronomical levels of heavy metals in the soil because of the pesticides they were using for this farm that was there before. When it got seeped into the soil, it created these crazy levels of heavy metal. And now people are living on this land now, right? So what impact is that having on the community, the land, right? So I think all these things are they matter. But I think if you remove enough of them, you can remove enough toxicity to allow your body to heal and keep things at bay, right? And I think it's all about balance. It's so many factors. It's multifaceted. I think you're really describing that really well.
Yeah.
And I'm really enjoying this conversation. This is wonderful.
Well, I think that's the number one question I get in my practice. Is there a cure for Lyme disease? Right? And, the answer that I give people is, I don't know. I don't know if there's a cure. I know, and maybe we could get into this here in a minute of,
Yeah.
I know that I was rather healthy for 4 years. I have, a really amazing practice. I don't feel like I really had symptoms on a day-to-day basis. And then, boom, I had, COVID, a really bad mold exposure, a major life stress. And here I am now having seizures again. Right. But what I do believe is that we can help heal our immune systems and heal the
Yes.
damage that these infections have done on our body, that there is no reason that we should not be able to live a really healthy life.
I agree. And I would answer that question. The answer is yes. Lyme disease can be cured because, again, what is Lyme disease? If you just had Borrelia burgdorferi and we lived in a bubble, I'm not sure that any of us would be as sick as we are, right? In fact, I don't think, I'll say I feel very strongly none of us would be. It's all the other things. The more we do to get ourselves healthy, the more we can be cured. Now, if we have, this series of unfortunate events, right? A really bad case of COVID, then we have all these other things happen in our lives. Okay, we were more susceptible because our bodies were compromised. Things that may have been there that were managed before because we couldn't fully eradicate them. And that could be, by the way, not just Lyme disease, viruses. We know from the ILADS conference and all these other brilliant Lyme doctors like yourself, Dr. Stein, that there are other pathogens besides Lyme that will be with us forever. They
Absolutely.
make us sick again, right? But now it happens. Dr. Stein goes back and she goes, I got this. And you're starting to go back and aggressively rebuild your body and you will be cured again, in my opinion, right? So that's how I look at this. I mean, what are your views on that?
No, that's exactly it, right? And I think, I have this terrible habit of saying Lyme disease. And when I really say Lyme disease, I think that I mean vector-borne illness, right? There's so many different pathogens that can affect us. And, I think that you said it so beautifully that I almost don't really have much to add to that.
I think Rich wants to jump in. I can say,
So I think the debate that we're having, because I agree with both of you as well, and I think Matt, I generally try not to compliment Matt, but I think he said that beautifully as well. But I think the bigger debate is: do we have to clear our body of Lyme? Right? Do we have to clear our body of all of these vector borne pathogens? And I think the answer to that is no. I don't think you have to clear your body of them. I think you just have to bring your body in balance, get back into homeostasis. And look, I guess for those of you who have been on this journey, it is anxiety producing for someone to hear, hey, you could have a relapse like the relapse you have, Dr. Stein. I mean, if you can relapse, anybody can relapse, right? I mean, with all the resources you have and all the knowledge that you have, I mean, you're schooling us and you're a 500 and whatever, guest, right? So if it can happen to you, it can happen to anyone. But really, I think sometimes we focus a little too much on killing the bugs and clearing the bugs when our goal should be just to get our body back into homeostasis and just rebuild our immune system, rebuild our neural pathways, and of course, be ready for a potential relapse, but recognize that the relapse is not going to be what it had been, because we've now developed this whole toolbox of tools and all this knowledge about our brain and our body that's going to allow us to get back into homeostasis I would think on a shorter path.
Right. And, I believed in this therapy already, right? Having learned it, having watched hundreds of patients go through it at the clinic. And, it's a basis of what I do in my practice now too. I already believed in the cell membrane stabilization therapy, but then when I got sick again, there was no doubt in my mind that was the first thing I was doing, right? It was 2 days later, I'm hooked up to an IV doing, IVPC on myself. And I think that's really, I think, a part of the story that I think is really important and highlights what you just said of, I did not do any antibiotics the second time around. I didn't do any herbs. I only did this therapy. And I believe in this therapy now more than ever, watching how much it changed my life. And like, look, this therapy, it sucks to go through. I just want to say that some of my patients, they call it chemo for Lyme patients. You get sick on it because we are literally, stripping the body's toxins, and that's why, kind of bringing in that herxing, that's why it's so important to walk alongside these patients and give them the tools to get through this therapy. Because at some point in time, as we're detoxing the cells, I kind of look at it as this three-staged approach of, maybe you're not really noticing anything, and then all of a sudden you get really sick. And that's when I go, yeah, this is working, right? And our patients get sick, maybe, we start to see liver enzyme elevation, and that tells me the liver enzymes are really working at this point to increase detox. You're getting sick, and I'm helping you through that. And then and I keep telling you, one day you're going to come into my office and you're going to do this IV and you're going to tell me, Dr. Stein, I felt so good after this IV. And that's what I see every time. And, my nurse was just kind of counseling. I'm teaching the other doctors in my clinic how to do this therapy now. And, my nurse was just counseling the other physicians that she's right. I see it. I see it every time with these patients is all of a sudden they come in and they get this treatment and they're like, I had the best day afterwards. I went out and I did this, and this, or I cooked my husband dinner and, I felt so good. And then after that, we start to see for the next couple of weeks of your treatment, you're feeling better and better and better. Right. And that's, that was my experience. That was my exact experience. And so I'm coaching my patients through this for a couple of years. And then now I'm in a situation where I'm going through it. And I have to tell you, I have never felt better. By the end of this treatment, my brain was working better. My energy was better. Finally, my pain feels better. I mean, it was incredible to see that I didn't need to jump to all of these hard, hitting, antimicrobials that, can cause, GI symptoms and adverse effects, that I can do something on a cellular level to heal myself.
Right. But you also recognize that your microbial level was probably in a place where you didn't need to support your body by reducing the microbial level. You just had to enhance your immune health, and your immune health allowed everything to get back into homeostasis, right?
Right. And that's why I think, it's so important for me that, during the steps of recovery, one of the things I tell my patients is there's going to be a point, because listen, I don't do cell membrane therapy on everyone, right? Some of them, we never even do that because we don't need to.
Right.
But I tell them there's going to be a point in your recovery that you are going to feel better and you are going to want to stop treatment with me. You're going to have supplement fatigue and you're going to feel better. You're going to have your life back and you just want to go. I said, please don't. I said, stick with me for a little bit longer, because that last step is so important. And I do believe that if we help regulate the cells, and it's not just through this therapy, right? We have peptide therapy, we have other therapies we can use to help our immune system. But if we can complete that last step, I do wonder if we could prevent relapse in the future.
So I told Matt we were going to love you, and we really, I loved you when I met you at iLads, and we love you even more, which is why we had the long form. But we've had you almost 2 hours.
Oh my goodness.
That is really the outside parameter for the podcast. So what we'd like to do is we're gonna have to invite you back again.
Yes, we
Let's
have a
do
lot more
it.
to talk about.
We can expand on this even further, but there is a bandwidth for folks who are listening to podcasts. And
Absolutely.
it really is.
I know you and I could talk about this all day, but
Yeah.
yes, let's do it again.
This was I mean, a wonderful podcast. So let's tie it. Let's bring our curve now to the end of the story.
Sure.
So talk to us about how this journey that you've been on has taught you about your identity, about what you were created to do, about how you became a more pure version of yourself and how you are now capable of serving the world, and certainly the world of people who you're called to serve in a way that you would not have been able to serve them had you not been on this long journey.
Right. I mean, I tell this story to people, and oftentimes they're listening and they go, wow, poor you went through so much. And I look at it and I go, no, like I am so thankful that I went through all of this, because going through all of this taught me resilience. Going through all of this taught me to open up my mind that anything can be possible in life. And it asked me to challenge authority and ask questions, and I really feel as though I had to go through all of this in order to help shape the future of Lyme disease in the world. And, that has just become my absolute passion, and that has become my identity, right? My identity was that I was sick and that there was no answer and that I couldn't get better. And now, look at me now, right? Like I am so passionate. I mean, I live, breathe, sleep, and eat this medicine. 3:00 in the morning, you find me reading things or listening to your podcast for the last few weeks is, what I've been doing. And it's, I really think, an experience that I needed to go through in order to find my identity and become the Lyme doctor that I am today.
That is a perfect and beautiful way to end this podcast, Dr. Stein. Thank you so much for being vulnerable with us, sharing everything you've shared with us, spending 2 hours of your life with us, recounting, I know, these very difficult times in your life. And thank you for doing all the great work that you're doing for the Lyme community.
Thank you, guys. It was so much fun to talk to you guys today.